This lecture introduces aesthetics and two very important thinkers who are going to be very instrumental in the field of art history moving forward, for they set the groundwork of limiting and/or freeing, we should say, art from its descriptive role in, say, religion and/or its didactic purpose. For with aesthetics, we're looking at understanding a work free from these concerns. Aesthetics, of course, coming from the Greek, is the study of beauty and was known since antiquity. But in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, we find new approaches to understanding how we engage with art that will be seminal moving forward. Now, aesthetics being the study of beauty, for the ancient Greeks meant they would discuss what actually makes something beautiful. How do we identify it? How do we, once again, classify it and discuss it? Now, we know that before the 18th century, we know that the sensory knowledge that one would get from looking at a painting or a sculpture was seen as inferior to rational thought or arguing something rationally. Now, in the 18th century, we find that there are two distinct forms of knowing that are identified and divided. One being logic, which you can logically argue something as being true or false. The other one being aesthetics. So these are separate concerns now and does not privilege one over the other. Instead, we find that aesthetics becomes a very powerful way to actually understand the world around us. The two thinkers that would be instrumental in the understanding of aesthetics, these aestheticians as we call them, would be Kant and Hegel. They are going to argue that understanding emotions relating to beauty and art is a very powerful, once again, understanding of the world around us and how we engage with it. This comes out of empiricism, that being the belief that art is going to be based on an independent ideal is going to shift at this time to one that is a product of the human mind and emotions. So empiricism in the 18th century, which led to the Enlightenment, demanded that we verify things physically through our five senses. And so now we start to question how we actually engage with beauty and works of art. And we're now going to argue that art is not going to be dependent on a system such as religion to give it validity, but instead is going to be a product of our mind and how we feel about it. Now, art is now going to be understood as a process of experience. We've all heard the old question and the old riddle, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? This brings to our minds this notion that we are perceiving beings. Thus, to be is to be perceived. So here we're calling attention to the fact that humans experience the world. That's what makes us human. And so we're thinking now and identifying exactly how we experience the world. So empiricism is going to be based on observation, and this is going to be hostile to the system of understanding the world that directly preceded it in the 17th century, known as rationalism. So we find that in rationalism, the notion of beauty and or value in a work would be related to what it does, such as make us think about God or reinforce religious dogma. So we find that in this instance, truth is going to be intellectual or deductive. Beauty, however, on the other hand, is not a quality, but as they will come to argue now, exists in our minds as we contemplate it. Therefore, each mind is going to perceive beauty differently. Thus, of course, the adage, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We experience things differently as human beings. Now, the problem with this, as will be identified here shortly by Kant, is that we experience the world in a jumbled and confused way. So we must look at objects objectively and train ourselves to become critics, basically, as it becomes known in the 19th century, looking and discerning very carefully. The thinker that would be so important for establishing what we now understand as aesthetics and how we approach art is the philosopher Immanuel Kant. So Kant is going to put together three different systems for understanding how we view the world in his critiques. So he presents a comprehensive method for identifying and judging beauty and separates out the different functions of the mind. So we're going to think about things rationally versus emotionally, for instance. So in his critique of pure reason, his critique of practical reason, and his critique of judgment, he's going to break down how we're going to think, feel, or be conscious with our mind. Obviously, thinking about something is a different part of the mind that is going to relate the experience the world around us is going to have, versus feeling what the world is like and then being conscious. This can be broken down into what he calls pure reason, what is logical, practical reason, which is emotional, and then judgment, how we discern things. This is going to be the question of judgment and beauty in the three functions of the mind. Now, for him, experience is going to be based upon projective human minds or how we project our consciousness. Mind looks for patterns in the world around us, thus casting a pattern on the universe in general. Now, in his critique of judgment, which is the most important of his critiques as it relates to art and aesthetics, he argues that we cannot logically prove that something is beautiful or not. It is not a logical aspect of the mind. Instead, we're going to find that the wing of the mind where beauty is known is different. So he separates the areas of the mind and relates how we interact and identify beauty from the imaginative to the cognitive. The imaginative, as Kant is going to outline, perceives the world around us. The cognitive, or the rational part, discerns it and relates these experiences to concepts or ideas that we have. Thus, if we look at things like roses or sunsets, they are not beautiful in the object itself. It's merely different refracted wavelengths of light that we're looking at. So we find that it's also not going to be in the mind, but instead the product of the transaction between how we're looking at the world and how, once again, we're processing information. Therefore, we sense the purpose of beauty, but there is no purpose. The object of beauty has no utilitarian motive, as he would say. Therefore, something cannot try to be beautiful. It just is. Hence, a rose is a rose is a rose. In order to experience this beauty, we must be disinterested as well. Very important for understanding Kantian aesthetics. This notion of disinterestedness is going to be central for how we view modern art today. We don't have to understand it to have a didactic purpose. It can just be beautiful. Now, his official definition for what is beautiful is as follows, quote, "Taste is the faculty of estimating an object or a mode of representation by means of a delight or aversion apart from any interest. The object of such a delight is called beautiful." Therefore, we find that something that delights us is known as beautiful, but it cannot have a purpose beyond that. And so he's going to conclude that beauty must exist because it is necessary for the human mind. It is impossible for us not to imagine a world where beauty is not in it. Therefore, in this argument, what is most important is that with aesthetics, he's setting up this powerful category of human response instead of the previously understood low-grade use of the mind. Understanding beauty and interacting with it in the world is a fundamental human activity, he's going to argue. Thus, this gives art more independence and more importance. So we're separating, as a second point that he makes here, that has long-term consequences on how we define art. He'll separate out beauty and art in beauty from economic pursuits. Thereby, someone cannot create something that is considered art and beautiful if they're only interested in getting paid for it. They must be disinterested, in fact, and purposefully ignores context and states that universal beauty must exist regardless of context. So in this, as I've already probably guessed, he creates this subject-object dilemma like Winckelmann, where we have this notion of the in and out, which is cyclical in the process by way we understand something. So once again, the person perceiving it is going to be outside. The notion of beauty is inside. Whatever it is you're looking is going to be bound to language and words. And so this is still a logocentristic system whereby we're going to be describing beauty after we experience it. So as we talked about last time with Baxendale and his patterns of intention, it's the effect something has on us, not describing the object itself. A very important distinction to make. The next thinker that builds upon this notion of aesthetics is going to be Hegel. So in Hegelian philosophy that he is going to publish in his very instrumental publication, The Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807, he will further restrict the notion of aesthetics to art. Notably, Kant did not solely apply his notion of beauty to artworks. Instead, he uses several examples like sunsets, roses, and so on. So we find that Hegel, on the other hand, applies this directly to art, disregarding what we might call natural beauty, that being plants or how we experience the world and find awe and beauty in it. So for Kant, the philosophy of beauty is based on perception and feeling, how we engage with what we're looking at. For Hegel, he adds to this the notion that understanding beauty is on knowing and rational discernment, that we need to be able to identify and be able to classify different types of beauty in works of art. Therefore, art has truth according to Hegel, and is not just not only an a priori existence. Therefore, it's a product of the human mind that can be understood as truthful and help us identify what is true in the world around us. As part of the phenomenology of the spirit, obviously originally published in German, is this notion of Geist, or spirit as it translates into English. So this notion for Hegel is very important. For this world spirit, he is going to see as the essential idea, or God, unfolding through time. And it reveals itself through art, religion, and philosophy, all of the endeavors that humans have in trying to understand what is truth, what is the divine. So we know that he sets up these 4 points. Number 1, that we find the Geist evolving through nature. Number 2, that it manifests in the individual or subjective mind. Number 3, that in the state or the objective mind. And finally, the spirit can be seen in truth, the absolute mind. Therefore, the spirit is going to move through history with providence because he gives it its own consciousness and will. This notion will be very important moving forward in trying to identify how the evolution of art takes place and what is driving it. Why do we see these stylistic changes? Why do we have a development within a culture from something that is seemingly more abstract to something that's more realistic? This is his answer. It is the Geist that is controlling behind the scenes what is happening, being revealed. So this is obviously a transcendentalist or hierarchist approach to understanding the world that assumes there is a higher reality that can be dealt with on earth. This comes first from Plato and then is adopted by Christian thinkers. For you find that God, as they would understand it, or the realm of forms, as Plato would put it, can be glimpsed here on earth if we know how to look at it, and usually through the products of human imagination, like poetry and art. Therefore, the spirit is going to manifest itself differently in different forms, and it's going to be manifested more clearly in certain types of forms. So in ascending order of spirituality, these are architecture, sculpture, painting, music, and poetry. Importantly, if you look at these different art forms, they move from the most concrete to the most intangible. Therefore, if you're trying to represent something spiritual, it makes more sense for Hegel that this could take place in an expression that is equally intangible, such as the spoken word or music, which is merely oral. It doesn't have a form or a body, for instance. So the role of art, according to Hegel, and this continues in many traditions in art history to this day, is to reveal the truth of the spirit, that we find over time certain works are going to reveal, as Winkelmann talked about earlier, the kind of essence of what they're trying to communicate, or they understand the supernatural better at that time. So beauty, as Hegel would say, is the sensory appearance of this idea. So we can see, for instance, in the Apollo Belvedere, the manifestation of what beauty is. Now, it's most accessible in art because it uses symbolism to capture an idea. Artworks are never what they represent. They are going to be two-dimensional renditions of things in the real world, or sculpture is merely trying to represent something else, such as a human or a god. Therefore, the symbol of what you're looking at here of these nymphs playing is never identical with the idea that it's trying to communicate. So you find that, as Hegel would say, an image of God, like an icon or an image of Christ, is not the same as God himself. It's merely a representation, a symbol of that idea, trying to communicate what the divine actually is. Therefore, some art forms, as we mentioned, are better because they embody this symbol differently. Painting is more abstract and less physical than sculpture, for instance, so the spirit is going to be more accurately represented because it's purer. Architecture, Hegel states, is the worst at this because it is the most physical. Poetry is the best. Now, according to Hegel and the Hegelian tradition of how art evolves over time, he says there's always three phases that keep repeating, and this is a very popular idea. We find that, number one, we always start with the symbolic, or otherwise known as the pre-classical phase. This phase is going to be seen in works such as the ancient Egyptians, whereby we see it exemplifying and maturing the spirit. But, as Hegel would state, their work seems rather stilted, rather stunted and stiff. Therefore, the symbol was left undeciphered, or they did not fully understand what the spirit was and how to represent it. Now remember, he is a Christian and is setting up that we're trying to see the Christian God throughout art and all cultures. Therefore, obviously, the Egyptians were not Christians, so they couldn't have understood how to represent the spirit. The second phase, he states, is going to be the classical or the golden age, where you have a more rational use of the human body in an attempt to reveal the spirit. This is where things are more naturalistic, like the ancient Greeks. Finally, he states, we always are going to evolve into the Romantic period, where we find that in the post-classical, as he calls it, or the Christian era, the expression of the spirit is going to be seen in painting, the least physical. And so, because it is the Christian God they're trying to represent, it is going to more effectively be represented by Christians. Now, these three ways of knowing the spirit, art, religion, and philosophy, is also going to develop how we understand the spirit itself and ourselves within it. Here's an example of what he's talking about, with ancient Egypt being the symbolic or pre-classical phase, which does not fully reveal itself in the idea of the spirit. The second being the classical or golden age, where we see a more naturalistic representation of what the forms are, such as a god. Finally, in the Romantic or Christian era, you have the post-classical, which most clearly understands the divine in art. Now, he is, of course, German, and so you find that the northern understanding of Lutheranism is going to move beyond showing God because of the rejection of pictorial imagery that begins with Martin Luther, and slowly and eventually is going to be replaced with things like landscapes, whereby we have Romantic painters like Friedrich showing once again wanderers above the mist because God is present in nature. We no longer have to show the image of God because we now understand it best and can show it in its most immaterial form. Now, these two thinkers are going to set up what is the foundations for art history and aesthetics. There are some limitations to their arguments, however, as Rodowick is going to point out in Impure Mimesis, or the Ends of the Aesthetic. So aesthetics, as Rodowick is going to state, is the reaction against context of production, trying to separate out the notion of money and the artistic economy from the notion of aesthetics and art. For how can we actually connect aesthetics, or being disinterested in what we're looking at, and also discuss the fact that these artists were paid, that their primary motivation for making these works is going to be a very difficult thing to reconcile. So Kant, as we mentioned, ignores context and certainly is going to state that art is produced independent of a salary the artist is making. So this creates this dilemma of the subject-object, or the inside and outside of a work of art, or the understanding of beauty. So aesthetics, as Kant argues, is a cyclical interpretation that is involving the process of exchange between us and what we're looking at, such as the Venus de Milo seen here. So this is, of course, going to be logocentristic and or representing logocentrism, or that we still have to talk about beauty in terms of words. So Kant does not discuss art directly, but instead the judgment of art. Judgment is bound up in language and words for these philosophers and aestheticians. Now, critics, as Kant would state in this system, cannot be objective about art. Therefore, they're not disinterested and not universal, because critics later on, remember, identify certain works and are going to privilege certain types of works over others. We have to select certain things to talk about as being better examples than others. So we find that this is not being disinterested, so therefore we have a problem with those that talk about art to begin with in the system. So Kant actually assumes that art and nature are equivalent in his discussion. So he does not outright discuss art, but when talking about beauty, he elides the two notions of art and the natural world. But in fact, artists do not actually copy nature. They invent through their imagination or playfulness what is their interpretation of the world around them. So you can paint a sunset, but it is not the same as seeing a sunset or the natural phenomenon. It is your interpretation of it with these symbolic markings. So art is actually destroyed in this process because it is monetized, thus not aestheticized. So if we consider artists need to be paid, critics and those that write about art and or art historians are also paid. Therefore, we can't be aestheticians because we have a motivation to actually like certain things more than others, and to like art in general. Next time, we'll continue on with form, content, and style with formalism and the development of systems that build on the Kantian and Hegelian systems, specifically with Wolf-Lehn and Gombrich.